Very interesting to me how most things that seem so important and so significant right now will lose all of that as time passes. The current events of 10 years ago are nothing but a dim memory for most of us. Now, I realize that's not true of everything that happens. There are some things that just stick indelibly in our minds. But for the most part, whatever was going on 10 years ago, I don't remember very well. I'd have to be reminded, and even then, I might not remember. Most urgent matters fade away with time. But that's not true of the events that surround the death of Jesus. If the Scriptures are to be believed, that event is the focal point of all history. And what we're presently reading and studying about in the Gospel of Mark are the most crucial events that have ever taken place. So it's important. Now, it's more than important. It's vital that we know and understand what the Bible tells us about those events. So today we continue our study of the wonderful gospel that we call Mark. And we're going to read from chapter 15. David, you want to put that up on the screen? The first 20 verses. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, as the song just said. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You've said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of?" But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now, it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is, the praetorium. They called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff, and they spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him, and then they led him out to crucify him. The trial of Jesus now moves from the house of the high priest and the Sanhedrin council that had gathered there to the Roman governor Pilate. And Pilate's first question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" indicates that this was the charge leveled against him by the Jewish leaders. And that charge is significant. Pilate wouldn't have put Jesus on trial for a violation of some local religious tradition or law. He would not have put him on trial. But if he claims to be a king, then he might be guilty of a crime against the sovereignty of Rome and the power of Rome. And so the governor has to take some official action against him. And I'm sure you noticed, and I pointed this out just a moment ago, that when they sent Jesus to Pilate, they bound him. That is, they put him in chains or in tethers of some sort. And that would have told Pilate that these religious leaders thought that Jesus was a threat to public order. And so they handcuffed him. Can you imagine that? Jesus. They tie him up, handcuff him, whatever it is that they did. And that says, we're really afraid of this guy. He's a real threat to what's going on here in Jerusalem. Pilate would have noticed that. Now, in response to Pilate's question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus gives a rather puzzling answer. Some versions have him saying, "Yes, it is as you say," but it's more likely translated like this. Now catch this. Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "Well, if you say so." Or something like this, "Whatever you say." Rather interesting answer that he gives. And then he doesn't answer or utter another word in the Gospel of Mark. Not another word do we hear from Jesus. I think he's refusing to defend himself in this Gentile court. He leaves it to God to provide the answer, and then when God does act in the resurrection, some will believe and some will still be blind to the truth. Now, only in the New Testament do we hear of the practice of releasing a prisoner that was requested by the crowd. There is no outside evidence that this ever happened, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. The governor had the power to do whatever he wanted, and the release of a prisoner once a year to appease the people is not improbable or unlikely at all. The crowd came to Pilate. They asked him to do what he usually did, and then they asked him to release Barabbas. Did you notice who was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising? That's quite revealing to me. Do you realize, I don't know what you think about Barabbas, but Barabbas may have been a right-wing revolutionary fighting to overthrow the Roman government, an insurrectionist, a rebel. And if he was, it's very likely that he is a hero in the minds of these people. A hero. Now, I realize that we're told that the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas, but it may be the crowd really liked this guy. I mean, he's doing something to free us from Roman tyranny. He's with the insurrectionists. He's with the rebels. And so they make that choice. And that choice is both ironic and it has far-reaching consequences. And here's what I mean by that. Jesus, who in my estimation had no interest in causing political or social upheaval, will be crucified between two brigands, two thieves, while Barabbas, a brigand who is guilty of murder, will go free because Jesus has taken his place on the cross that was intended for Barabbas. The crowd chooses the one who takes the lives of others for his own selfish interests, and the crowd condemns the one who gives his life in obedience to God. And that is a fatal choice. The violence and the rebellion of renegades like Barabbas will continue to escalate until in AD 66 it breaks out in open warfare with the Romans, and the outcome was inevitable. 4 years later, AD 70, Rome destroys Jerusalem. The temple kills almost everybody in the city with this brutal siege. How ironic. The chief priests feared Jesus because they saw him as a threat to the temple ritual and to their own power base. They urged the release of one whose violent ways will eventually bring terror and destruction to their own land. What irony. What an interesting development that is. One little kind of sidebar here. The name Barabbas comes from two Aramaic words, Bar, meaning son, and Abba, meaning father. Barabbas, son of the Father. Isn't that interesting? That's what the name means. Mark seems to be raising the question, who really is the Son of the Father? Is it Jesus or Barabbas? And I believe he calls on his readers to make a choice. And I thought, what a tremendous lesson in this for us. Folks, we have to be very careful and prayerful about our choices. You young people need to be careful about your choices, whether as individuals, we need to be careful about our choices as a faith community. And as a nation, we need to be careful about what we choose and what we decide. The choice of Barabbas by that mob that day points out the human preference to make choices that usually have to do with our narrow, selfish hopes and dreams. In our text, the crowd was choosing a perverted nationalism. And we often do the same. We make choices based on purely selfish motives and desires. How's this going to affect me? How's this going to affect my income? How's this going to affect my retirement? How's this going to affect, and we can go on and on. Let me repeat, be careful and be prayerful as you make life decisions. Seek God's will, not your own. Even if His will involves sacrifice, even if it involves hardship, choose the will of God as Jesus did. Be very careful, though, about your choices. Now, Pilate makes this feeble little effort to release Jesus, but when the crowd keeps clamoring for his death, the governor says, why? What crime has he committed? But as the pressure mounts and wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate gives in to their bloodlust. There are some people through the ages who have seen Pilate in a very sympathetic way. Did you know that the Ethiopic and the Coptic churches in Africa have canonized him? They've made him a saint. Hard to believe, but in those churches, Pilate is a saint. Many today, I think, consider Pilate to have been just this innocent, bewildered bystander caught up in this impossible situation. Mark doesn't see him that way at all. While Pilate bears no greater guilt than anybody else, he is guilty. I've asked myself as I read this again, was this guy in charge or not? I mean, he's the governor. Was he in charge or not? And did you notice the questions? Verse 2, are you the king of the Jews? Verse 3, aren't you going to answer? Verse 9, do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Verse 12, what shall I do with the one that you call the king of the Jews? Verse 14, why? What crime has he committed? He's completely indecisive. And he finally caves in to moral cowardice. He's the Roman governor. He can do as he wishes. But in the end, he serves the wishes of the Jewish leaders and the crowd. Pilate is the type of leader who always has his finger in the wind to see which way it's blowing. And when I wrote that, I thought, a lot of you don't even know what I'm talking about, do you? So I need to explain to you what finger in the wind means. You do this. You hold it up, and whichever way the wind is blowing, you feel the coolness on your finger. And that's what Pilate did. He says, which way's the wind blowing? What are people wanting? What's the popular opinion? And then he makes his decision that way. He cares nothing for truth. He cares nothing for justice. He doesn't want to take any chances. No risk is involved here, so he hands Jesus over to be crucified. May I suggest there are a lot of people today who are just like Pilate? When they think of Jesus, they see no real harm in him. I mean, Jesus is a pretty good guy, kind of like some of the things he said, but they see no reason to risk anything for him. They see no reason to take a stand for him, no reason to stand for the kind of life that he asks us to live. Folks, great evil comes from moral and spiritual indifference. Can I say it again? Great evil comes from moral and spiritual indifference. Pilate, unconcerned with justice, allows evil to be unleashed. And we can do the same thing by being indifferent, by being careless about truth and justice and morals and ethics. The old saying is really true. The only thing evil needs to prevail is for good people to do nothing. All we have to do is say, I'm not going to do anything, I'm just indifferent, doesn't matter. And all of a sudden, evil begins to have its way. Now, without specifying any one issue, I want to urge all of you to do this. Please listen. If you're concerned about an area of life where you see injustice, where you see brutality, where you see human suffering, where you see lies and falsehoods, get involved in trying to correct the wrong if you can. Don't remain indifferent and say, well, it's somebody else's problem. I'm not going to think about that. Great evil comes from moral indifference. At least pray about these things, and then wherever you can get involved, become involved. I said I wasn't going to specify. I am. Several of us in the office have been talking recent months about human trafficking. And just this week, the Christian Chronicle had an article about the young Christian women who were abducted in Nigeria, about 250 women from that Christian school. And the leader of the Boko Haram says, we're going to sell them. You know where they're going to sell them. They're going to become sex slaves all over the world. We need to be concerned. It's happening in our city. It's happening in our country. Thousands upon thousands of mainly women and girls are being used this way. We can't just say, oh, it's somebody else's problem. I don't know how to, I'm not telling you how to get involved. I don't know how right now. But we can't remain indifferent, because as we remain indifferent, great evil prevails, and it is prevailing in our world right now. Well, I need to go on. In the final portion of our text, Mark tells about the Roman soldiers' treatment of Jesus. First, he was flogged or scourged or whipped. That was a preliminary, a customary preliminary to crucifixion. And then the whole company of soldiers, maybe as many as 600 of them, joined in mocking and deriding him as this ridiculous, weak, false king. See, I think they saw something amusing. They saw something absurd about this whole situation. And so they put the crown of thorns on, and then they mockingly kneeled before him, saying, "Oh, Hale, King of the Jews." And they're laughing about this. They're just making fun of him. But there's another great irony here, folks. These soldiers unwittingly testify to a truth that was hidden from them. Because Jesus really is not just a king, he is the king. And someday every knee will bow before him and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. And these soldiers are unwittingly giving testimony to the fact that he is king. Now, right now, while they're doing this, and even in our day and time, the world cannot comprehend a king like this. We can't comprehend a king who puts himself last, who takes on the role of a servant, and who willingly dies for his people. That's the kingship of Christ right now. But one day, if Scripture can be believed, he will return in a very different manner. And I want you to listen now. Listen carefully. I didn't have Neil put this up on the screen. Forgot to do that. But I want you to listen to what John, the Revelator, has to say about Christ. John says, I saw heaven standing open, and there before me was a white horse whose rider is called Faithful and True. With justice he judges and wages war. His eyes are like blazing fire. On his head are many crowns. He has a name written on him that no one knows but he himself. He's dressed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is the Word of God. The armies of heaven are following him, riding on white horses and dressed in fine linen, white and clean. And coming out of his mouth is a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. He will rule them with an iron scepter. He treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God Almighty. And on his robe and on his thigh he has this name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. It's Revelation chapter 10. He will not always be mocked and made fun of. There will come a time when he will be recognized by every single person in the universe that he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So Pilate's question comes back for all of us. Comes back, and we must answer it ourselves. What shall I do then with the one you call King of the Jews? What will you do with the one they call King of the Jews? Have you acknowledged him by confessing with your mouth and living your life in a way that says he is King of Kings, Lord of Lords? Have you acknowledged that? Have you put him on in baptism, in water baptism? I hope you'll think about your response to the question, what will you do with Jesus? It's a great question. I hope we won't do what Pilate did and just ignore truth, ignore justice, but that we will accept him, receive him as who he really is.